Good afternoon. My name is Titus Kime. Currently, I am a volunteer at the Minot Air Force Base Chapel, and I'd like to take a few moments to briefly share God's calling on my life to be an Air Force chaplain. Honestly, sharing the whole story would take a lot of time, but I will try to condense it to just the highlights. I like to say that God knew that I couldn't handle the full calling all at once, so He broke it up for me into stages. So I first felt the call to ministry in my late teens, but I had no clue what that meant. I grew up a Baptist missionaries kid, so I did have ministry exposure throughout my childhood and was taught to listen for God's call and to be looking for what purpose God may have for me. So when God called me to preach, I began training under my pastor at the time. The one thing I did know for sure was that that part of my purpose was going to be preaching or involve preaching, which was ironic to me at the time, considering my fear of public speaking. I like to call it the Moses complex. Um, Early on in my training, I felt like God was calling me in a different direction than the traditional church ministry I had been raised with. I was raised traditional Baptist, or better known as independent fundamental, but studying scripture for myself, God began to show me that there is more to being a Christian than holding denominational lines. And God burdened me with the desire for Christians to be biblical and nothing else. So little by little, God began to deal with me on a more personal level, showing me that there was more for me to learn in the way of discipline and dedication. So I enlisted in the Air Force. Over the course of my enlistment, I deployed a number of times, some to combat zones where I saw some pretty horrific things. Seeing men struggle with PTSD and struggling with it myself opened my eyes to the second part of God's calling, to help military members through the darkness of difficult times. Now, I was told by mentors early on that chaplaincy was not something I should pursue, that I would have to compromise my faith to be effective. So I struggled with how I would be able to follow God's call on my life. I did have an interest in psychology, so I began to look into the process of being an Air Force psychologist. I earned my bachelor's in psychology and applied to the Uniformed Services University of Health Science. But God quickly closed that door, and I was right back to square one, trying to figure out how I would fulfill God's call on my life. While I was stationed in Germany, I dedicated a lot of time to prayer and meditation. And really, that came during COVID time, during isolation periods and things like that. Well, God showed me during that time that I should begin working on a master's in pastoral counseling and gain as much experience as I could serving as the assistant pastor at the church there. It was during a revival meeting that God reignited my passion for preaching, focusing on discipleship and being mentored more perfectly in ministry. But it wasn't until a chaplain who is of my faith tradition, cut from the same cloth, as he put it, began to attending the same church as I was, and over the course of a few conversations, he explained to me the details of how chaplains serve and the protection the endorser provides that would allow me to remain faithful to my convictions. This clarified the rest of God's calling for me, and I immediately began working on meeting the requirements to be a chaplain.